Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creep Smith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. Tonight's story, Completely Alone. Thomas lived alone at a research compound in Antarctica. His schedule usually consisted of reading or just pointlessly watching the computer monitors that always showed the same goddamn blizzard outside. He was the subject of an experiment. What were the effects of extended isolation on the human mind? Similar tests had been done before in vacant compounds and empty rooms, but none could quite carry across just how absolutely secluded you were staying in an Antarctic compound hundreds of miles away from any civilization. He'd been given enough food and drink for 2 years, even though he'd only be staying there for 1. Thomas had been warned about possible hallucinations before accepting the challenge for the sole purpose of the money that he so desperately needed. There weren't many unusual noises, thanks to the constant sounds of the air conditioning and, of course, the snowstorm outside, and for the past 3 months, Thomas had lived an extremely boring, but certainly bearable life. He'd also been given many books and an old television with some VHS tapes of movies to watch, which was actually quite the good thing. After 2 months, the storm began, and never ceased for even a moment. Thomas knew little of the weather, but he was beginning to think that this was unnatural. But eventually, he just got used to it. For now, he sat down at the bay of computer monitors that each displayed areas covered by the video cameras outside. The computers also had video games, but for some reason they were all horror, and not just run-of-the-mill, slightly disturbing horror either. Come to think of it, all of the movies he'd been provided were horror titles as well. And on top of the pile was The Thing, a movie about an Arctic compound and a horrifying alien creature. The people who'd sent Thomas here must have had quite sadistic minds for doing that to him. The books, well, they were all quite creepy as well, containing stories like The Telltale Heart. More than likely, these were here to ready him for the hallucinations. Or perhaps to prime his mind entirely. And since he'd been forewarned of them, and given all of these frightening things to fuel his imagination, Thomas knew for certain that the horrific creature standing motionless in front of camera 5 was not real. Its huge black eyes that were wide open and staring right into his own weren't real. Its gray, flaky skin that looked like that of an old corpse wasn't real. They were no more real than its needle-like teeth stretching across its gaping mouth. Its long hands that looked like pitchforks with fingers for tines attached to its thin, tall body. These were simply figments of his imagination. No, Thomas was not frightened. He simply stared at the monitor with a blank expression on his face as he realized that the screen had been frozen the whole time, along with all the others. Thomas wasn't the least bit afraid when the door to the small cubicle began to open, and there was no fear in Thomas as he felt a cold breath on his neck coming from behind him, because everything was fine. Because Thomas knew for a fact that he was alone. The extraterrestrial beings who had been observing him appeared satisfied with their research. Yeah, just as a general rule, if anyone ever wants you to spend a year alone isolated for science, you might want to say no. Thanks for listening. Stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.